Hello, and today we will continue to talk about the worst tortures that mankind has invented. You can watch the first part by clicking on the link in the corner of the screen. Also subscribe to the channel and like this video. Let's get started. Shiri, camel cap. A terrible fate awaited those whom the Zhuangzuangs, a union of nomadic Turkic-speaking peoples, took into slavery. They destroyed the slave's memory by a terrible torture, putting a broadcloth on the victim's head. This fate usually awaited young men captured in battle. How did it work? First, the slaves had their heads shaved, and every hair was carefully scraped off by the root. Executors slaughtered a camel and butchered its carcass. First of all, they divided its heaviest, densest neck part. Having divided the neck into pieces, they immediately stretched it over the shaved heads of the prisoners. These pieces stuck to the heads of the slaves like a band-aid. This was what it meant to put on a shiratini. After putting on the broadcloth, the doomed person's neck was chained in a special wooden log so that the test subject could not touch his head to the ground. In this form, they were taken away from crowded places so that no one could hear their frantic screams, and thrown there in an open field, with their hands and feet tied, in the sun, without water and without food. The torture lasted for 5 days. Only a few survived, and the rest died not from hunger or even thirst, but from unbearable, inhuman torment caused by the drying camel skin that was squeezed on their heads. Inexorably shrinking under the rays of the scorching sun, the camel's head was squeezed like an iron hoop. On the second day, the shaved hair of the martyrs began to sprout. The hard and straight Asian hair grew into the camel's skin, and in most cases, finding no way out, the hair bent and went back into the scalp, causing even more suffering. Within a day, a person would lose his mind. Only on the 5th day did the Zhuangzuang come to check whether any of the prisoners had survived. If they found at least one of the tortured alive, it was considered that the goal had been achieved. Those who underwent such a procedure either died, unable to withstand the torture, or lost their memory for the rest of their lives, turning into a mankurta, a slave who did not remember his past. The skin of one camel was enough to cover 5 or 6 broadside. Implantation of metals. Very strange torture was used in the Middle Ages. How did it work? A deep incision was made in a person's legs, where a piece of metal, iron, lead, etc., was inserted, and then the wound was sewn up. Over time, the metal oxidized, poisoning the body and causing terrible pain. Most often, the poor people tore the skin in the place where the metal was sewn and died of bleeding, dividing a person into 2 parts. This horrible execution originated in Thailand. It was used for criminals, mostly murderers. How does it work? The accused is placed in a hoodie woven from vines and stabbed with sharp objects. After that, his body is quickly cut into 2 parts. The upper half is immediately placed on a red-hot copper grate. This operation stops the blood and prolongs the life of the human part. A small addition: this torture is described in the book Justine, or The Successes of Vice by the Marquis de Sade. This is a small excerpt from a large text where de Sade allegedly describes the torture of the peoples of the world. But why allegedly? According to many critics, the Marquis was very fond of lying. He had an extraordinary imagination and a couple of delusions, so this torture, like some others, could have been a figment of his imagination. But we should not treat Donation Alphonse as the Baron of Munich. This torture, in my opinion, if it did not exist before, is quite realistic. Unless, of course, a person is drugged with painkillers, opiates, alcohol, etc., beforehand so that he or she does not die before his or her body touches the grate. Inflation with air through the anus. A horrific torture in which a person is inflated with air through the anus. There is evidence that in Russia even Peter the Great himself was guilty of this. Most often, thieves were executed in this way. How does it work? The victim was tied hand and foot. Then they took cotton and stuffed it into the poor man's ears, nose, and mouth. Bubbles were inserted into the anus, with the help of which a huge amount of air was pumped into the person, making him look like a balloon. After that, they plugged the person's anus with a piece of cotton. Then they opened 2 veins above the eyebrows, from which all the blood flowed out under enormous pressure. Sometimes the bound person was placed naked on the roof of the palace and shot with arrows until he died. Until 1970, this method was often used in Jordanian prisons. Palidro. The Neapolitan torturers lovingly called this torture palidro and were proud that this torture was first used in their native city. Although history has not preserved the name of its inventor, it was said that he was an expert in horse breeding and came up with an unusual device to tame his horses. Only a few decades later, those who liked to mock people turned the horse breeder's device into a real torture machine for people. The machine was a wooden frame, similar to a ladder, whose crossbars had a very sharp angle so that when a person was placed on them with their back, they would cut into the body from the back of the head to the heels. The staircase ended with a huge wooden spoon, into which the head was placed, as if in a cap. Dead man's bed, modern China. The Chinese Communist Party applies the dead man's bed torture mainly to those prisoners who try to protest against illegal imprisonment by means of hunger strikes. In most cases, these are prisoners of conscience who have been imprisoned for their beliefs. How does it work? The hands and feet of a prisoner stripped naked are tied to the corners of a bed, which has a wooden board with a hole cut out instead of a mattress. A bucket for excrement is placed under the hole. Often, the person's body is also tied tightly to the bed with ropes so that he or she cannot move at all. A person stays in this position continuously for several days to weeks. In some prisons, such as Shenyang Prison No. 2 and Jilin Prison, police officers also place a hard object under the victim's back to increase the suffering. It also happens that the bed is placed vertically and the person hangs for 3 to 4 days, stretched by the limbs. These torments are compounded by forced feeding, which is carried out with the help of a tube inserted through the nose into the esophagus, into which liquid food is poured. This procedure is carried out mainly by prisoners on the orders of the guards, not by medical workers. They do it in a very rude and unprofessional manner, often causing serious damage to the internal organs of a person. This torture causes displacement of vertebrae, joints of the arms and legs, as well as numbness and blackening of the limbs, which often leads to disability. Clamp, modern China. One of the medieval tortures used in modern Chinese prisons is wearing a wooden collar. It is put on the prisoner, which makes him unable to walk or stand normally. The clamp is a board 50 to 80 centimeters long, 30 to 50 centimeters wide and 10 to 15 centimeters thick. 2 holes for the legs are made in the middle of the clamp. The victim wearing the clamp has difficulty moving, has to crawl into bed and usually has to sit or lie down, as the upright position causes pain and leads to leg injuries. Without assistance, a person with a brace cannot go to the bathroom or eat. When the person gets out of bed, the clamp not only puts pressure on the legs and heels, causing pain, but the edge of the clamp clings to the bed and prevents the person from turning in it. At night, the prisoner is unable to turn around, and in winter, a short blanket does not cover his legs. An even worse form of this torture is called crawling with a wooden clamp. The guards put a collar on a person and order him to crawl on the concrete. If he stops, he is beaten on the back with a police baton. After an hour, the fingers, toenails and knees bleed heavily, while the back is covered with wounds from the blows. Putting to the stake. A terrible savage punishment came from the East. The essence of this execution was that a person was placed on his stomach, one person sat on him to prevent him from moving, and another held him by the neck. A stake was inserted into the person's anus, which was then driven in with a mallet, then the stake was driven into the ground. The weight of the body forced the stake to enter deeper and deeper, and finally it came out under the armpit or between the ribs. Thank you for watching. See you next time.